Gentlemen, 2024 is now in full swing, so it's time for a New Year's resolution check-in. Have you been taking care down there? It's never too late to level up your grooming game and keep your man maintained thanks to this video sponsor, Manscaped. Use offer code SKILLUP at manscaped.com for 20% off and free shipping. Stick around to the end of the video to learn more. Okay, here's the simplest, most direct, and most accurate summary of Skull and Bones that I can come up with. Ubisoft spent 11 years making an Assassin's Creed Black Flag spin-off that is objectively worse than Assassin's Creed Black Flag in every aspect. They then charged $70 for it, but also stuffed it full of in-game spending and a season pass. To top all of that off, they then declared it the world's first quadruple A video game, when it is, at an absolute stretch, a AA title, and realistically, I play many indie games that have better production values and more content at launch than this does. So at this point, you're like, oh shit, time to get the popcorn out, this is gonna be one hell of a roasting. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but that's actually not quite the case, because a lot of what I've just described there isn't about the game itself, it's about the context around the game, like its connection to Black Flag, its cursed development cycle, its price tag, and the fact that the CEO straight up lied to his shareholders about the very nature of what this game is and where it sits in the market. In context, Skull and Bones is a genuine fucking disaster. It is no exaggeration to say that every core element of this game, Black Flag did it better. Right down to the sailing and the ship combat, and that is the one thing that this game had to do better. They took out all of the on-foot pirate combat-y stuff, so you'd think they'd be able to spend all of that extra time and energy to make the ship combat deeper and better, but they didn't. They made it dumber and shittier, way shittier, and all they really added was like cannons that magically heal your allies if you shoot them. Like, how do you spend 11 years making a worse version of a game that you already made? Just think about what it would take to arrive at that result. That is just unfathomable. So, in comparison to Black Flag, in comparison to what we consider to be a reasonable price point, in comparison to what we would expect from a AAA game, let alone this ridiculous quadruple A label, Skull and Bones is a colossal failure. But, as I was playing it, I wasn't hating it. And broadly speaking, 20 hours in, I had a decent time with it. I did. I had some fun with Skull and Bones. And I've certainly reviewed many games that were objectively better than this, but that I disliked for a variety of reasons. So that led me on a strange thought exercise, like, why don't I hate this? This is obviously pretty disappointing on many fronts, so why don't I hate it? And I kind of arrived at two conclusions. Number one, it's really fucking cool to be a pirate, and try as they might, not even Ubisoft can mess that up. It's cool to have a pirate ship. It feels good to drop the sail and catch the wind. It's really nice to sail an expanse of water with pirate shanties playing in your ear. It's exciting to spy a distant vessel, accelerate to attack speed, and then let the cannonade roar. That shit is just cool, and while a lot of those things are worse here than they were in Black Flag, they aren't so much worse that they are ruined. Secondly, I really thought about how much Skull and Bones is undermined by those contextual elements. The link to Black Flag, the development timeline, the price tag, and Yves Guillemot's embarrassing comments. And I thought to myself, let's remove all of that. Let's imagine that Black Flag never existed, and this is the first time that Ubisoft had made a pirate game. Let's imagine that it wasn't stuck in development hell for 11 years, and instead had a thrifty 3 to 4 year development cycle that from the outside looking in seemed perfectly normal. Let's imagine that this game wasn't an absurd $70 plus extra for the deluxe or whatever, but a more reasonable $30. And let's imagine that Yves Guillemot never opened his mouth and said something so stupid that it's basically painted a target on this game's back for everyone with a social media account. Freed from all of that context, is Skull and Bones an absolute catastrophe? No, it's not. It's just a really average video game that most people are going to think is boring, but some people are going to find some enjoyment in because, to Ubisoft's credit, there isn't any other game quite like this one. This is totally different from Sea of Thieves or World of Warships or whatever. This is a really accessible, low-stakes, arcadey pirate game that you can play solo, and it's relaxing and it's repetitive, but if you're the kind of person that likes pirates, likes nautical combat, or just likes Ubisoft's style of open-world busywork combined with skin-in-box progression, you're probably going to have at least a little bit of fun with Skull and Bones, because I certainly did. So, I'm going to review Skull and Bones as a video game, and I'm going to tell you that it's broadly fine. But at the same time, I don't think we should ignore the broader context stuff, because I think Skull and Bones is a very powerful example of how much worse the business of video games has gotten over the years, and how brazen video game executives are in their lies to prop all of this up. Ubisoft really did spend 11 years to make a worse version of a game they already made so they could perpetually charge for it, and then the CEO of that company got up in front of everyone, including his shareholders, and tried to convince them that this game is a new frontier for the medium. Playing Skull and Bones is broadly fine, but when you think about what Skull and Bones is and represents, yeah, it definitely sucks.
Our fates are revealed in layers and often from plain sight.
Okay, so firstly, we need to describe what Skull and Bones actually is, because despite being in development for 11 years and being heavily marketed by Ubisoft, most people have no idea what this actually is. I've seen it compared to The Division, which is a very unusual comparison, given that it's nothing like The Division, and I say that as someone who covered The Division for a living. So what is it? Well, in broad strokes, I'd say that Skull and Bones is kind of like a really stripped back, pirate-themed survival game. It does have a campaign and missions, aka contracts, but they're extremely bare bones, no pun intended. There are world events that spawn on the map, but they're very few and far between. The main focus of the game is its sandbox, and you strike out from port with the intention of collecting materials that you can use to maintain your ship, both in terms of repairs and ammo, but also upgrade your ship by crafting new equipment. So enemy ships that you sink do not drop actual ship parts like a new cannon, but they will drop ore that you can then use to craft a cannon, so long as you have the blueprint, which you can earn by completing contracts or just buy it from a vendor standing on some far-flung island. All of that is in pursuit of upgrading your ship, but there's also an infamy system that reflects your overall standing as a pirate. The more contracts you complete, the more enemy ships you sink, the more your legend grows, giving you access to higher level upgrades and higher level contracts. Think of this as your player level, while your ship has its own level reflecting the quality of its armor, armaments, and furniture. So you can be like, what is the core of Far Cry? And the answer to that is clearing map markers and creating explosions. What is the core of modern day Assassin's Creed games? It's third-person melee combat and stealth missions in service of a sprawling narrative-led campaign. What is the core of Skull and Bones? It is a big, wide ocean that you sail around on so you can collect materials to craft ship upgrades. It's the focus on sandbox, materials, and crafting that make this feel more like a survival game than a lot of the other stuff in Ubisoft's portfolio. But that feeling also comes from just how little there is around that experience. Survival games typically feel very lean and mechanical, and that's usually a reflection of their focus on making their survival systems deep and flexible. Skull and Bones feels similarly lean in that it lacks a rewarding campaign experience, a proper narrative, a proper cast of characters, interesting mission design. It doesn't have any of those things, but it also doesn't have anything to compensate for those things being absent. All of its core systems, like sailing, combat, gathering, and crafting, are extremely one-dimensional. They all work perfectly well, but they're just basic, and in no aspect does Skull and Bones distinguish itself, even against the very game that inspired it all of those years ago, Black Flag. You can play this game solo, which is what I did during my 20 hours with it. However, some of the open world activities definitely require a group, and broadly speaking, I found some frustrating difficulty spikes towards the back end of my playthrough where it felt like a party would have really helped. So yeah, you can definitely play this solo, but not for everything, and do expect it to get a little hairy at times. The game is a seamless open world multiplayer game. I'm very hesitant to call it an MMO because it's not. But if you were to put it into that kind of MMO light category, I'd be like, yeah, maybe. As you sail around, you will see other players' ships, but not many, at least not in my experience. The seas feel really empty. Furthermore, you can actually call for aid when you're plundering a target or trying to do an open world event. I put out multiple of those calls during my 20-hour playthrough, and no one ever came. What about PvP? Well, yeah, the game does support PvP, but in my 20 or so hours, I never actually experienced it. That's because PvP is only for specific events during the leveling experience, and when those events were happening, there was just no one else around. There is a lot more PvP at the end game, but again, I spent a few hours at the end game and I couldn't find any PvP. I joined PvP events and no one else would show up, but it's definitely there. However, it is always optional, even at the end game. I'd go as far as to say as this is absolutely a PvE focused game that has a very limited number of very optional PvP events. This is not like Sea of Thieves, it is not a free-for-all out there. If you want to be left alone and just get on with your PvE pillaging, you can do that and no other players can mess with your fun. So, what about the whole getting out of your ship thing? Oh man, okay, so you can get out of your pirate ship in Skull and Bones. You can only do so at specific ports, so it's not like you can sail up to any shoreline and hop out like you could do 11 years ago in Black Flag. No, you sail up to a port, you hold down a button to disembark, the screen fades to black, and then all of a sudden you are magically ashore. There are two types of ports. There are main towns and outposts. The main towns are what you'd expect. It's a space for vendors to hang out, they hand out quests, they sell you things, they upgrade your ship, etc. Nothing else happens in these spaces, there's nothing else going on. There's even less going on at the outposts. These are things like old forts or deserted islands or smugglers' caves or whatever, and they're really weird in their construction because these spaces are often quite large, but they are completely empty, save for like two vendors, which are often in totally different sections of these areas. They also kind of dot them with random resources that you could just pick up off the ground, but they're in such small quantities that there's like no point in doing that. For example, when you craft a crate of cannonballs, you craft them 100 at a time. But here at these outposts, you can pick up a crate of cannonballs that contains like 10 or 15 of them. It's so weird, and it's so clear that these spaces have just been awkwardly tacked on, because at some point in the development, someone at the top said, people want to get out of their pirate ship, let's let them get out of their pirate ship. But they didn't actually come up with a good reason why you might want or need to get out of your pirate ship, other than to speak to an NPC and trigger more loading screens. Some further evidence of this comes in the way that this game handles gathering and harvesting. So this is pretty funny if you haven't seen it before, but you do need to chop down trees and mine ore in this game, and rather than do those things at the on-foot locations I just spoke about, which would make a lot of sense, you do it while you're on your ship. You sail up to a resource node, and then you press a button to bring up a minigame, and you press it again when the little thing is in the green zone to maximize your harvest, and you do that like 3 or 4 times, and then that's it. The stuff just materializes in your cargo. It is super shitty. Like, come on guys, what were you thinking when you did this? You literally made on-foot areas where you can't do the things you'd expect to be able to do there, like chop down trees, and instead you've invented this ridiculous minigame that allows your actual pirate ship to chop down trees. It's farcical. And finally, just to clear up any confusion, there is no on-foot combat in this game at all. You cannot fight on land, and when you board another ship, here's what happens.
We will make a fortune from this. Come on! Keep going!
Did you blink and miss it? Yeah, that's the boarding cutscene that plays. When I board an enemy ship, a quick cutscene shows us hauling them close to us, and then it just cuts to a loot screen, even when I'm in the middle of combat with other ships, by the way, which is super annoying, and then I have to quickly press the collect all loot button, and that's it. That's what boarding a ship is like in Skull and Bones. Now look, I'm sure many people would have preferred it if you could also fight on land and also fight on the decks of ships, but I think that would be asking for just a bit much. Like, imagine a game that would let you do both of those things in one video game. That's almost too much video game, and I think Ubisoft did us a favor by limiting this to ship-only combat, because if we had to handle both ship-to-ship combat and melee combat in the same game, that would be too much for our tiny brains. We just wouldn't be able to handle that. I am, of course, being an asshole. But am I though? Like 11 years ago, we got to walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. And now, a full console generation later, we get to do less than half of that, but also pay more for it. while also being told that it is quadruple A. So, that is an overview of what Skull and Bones is. Now let's take a deeper look at each of its components.
Smell that salt, spice, and sin, Captain.
My officers say you can help tear us free from their rules.
Witness. I was cut down before I had a chance to grow.
What a world we live in, eh?
If I asked you to deliberately come up with the most generic, boring, played-out beginnings of a pirate story you could think of, you would almost surely come up with something slightly more interesting than what Ubisoft arrived at. You are a human being who gets shipwrecked in a far-off land and falls in with the pirate community, so you set about building your legend with the aim of becoming the most feared pirate on the Seven Seas, even though there's really only like one sea here in Skull and Bones. There's a character creator, it's abysmal. There's a small tutorial section where you learn the basics of shipcraft and hunting. You pull into the pirate port of St. Anne, and it's there that you meet the pirate captain John Skurlock, who takes you under his wing, and that's where things really kick off. So Skull and Bones does have a campaign, but calling it a campaign kind of creates a lot of expectations that Skull and Bones is going to fail to meet at every turn. The campaign is much closer to what you would experience in an older MMORPG, where fetch quests are given the lightest drizzling of narrative dressing and strung together to create the illusion of a campaign. This is really typified by the story or lack thereof. There are two main NPCs in this game who speak about something other than what they're planning to sell you or what materials they need you to gather for them on a fetch quest. John Skurlock is one of those NPCs, and he essentially just invites you into his office to deliver these soliloquies, which are occasionally punctuated by dialogue options that have absolutely no bearing on how conversations will end. In his ramblings, he lists the names of other pirates or French merchant commanders or whoever else, and these are his enemies that he's going to send you to kill. But you never actually see any of these people's faces. You just see their names on the ships that you are about to sink. So imagine sitting through 5 cutscenes where Skurlock is complaining about a pirate called, I don't know, Roger, whatever. And Skurlock's like, "Arr, I hate Roger, I hate him so much, let's go and ruin Roger's supply lines." And then Skurlock will send you to sink 3 merchant ships who are on their way to make a delivery for Roger. And so you go and do that, and you come back, and Skurlock's like, "Good job, matey, you really wrecked Roger's day, but he's still up to no good. Let's go plunder a cloth factory so he can't fix his sails." So you go to this cloth factory and lay siege to it by just parking outside it for a while and shooting any ship that rocks up. And then you come back and Skurlock's like, "Okay, great, now it's time to kill Roger." And then you go and sink Roger's ship, and that's the end of it. But you've never met Roger, you've never laid eyes on him, you have no idea who he is. He literally could be a complete figment of Skurlock's imagination for all you know, and you're just out there sinking perfectly innocent ships and besieging innocent cloth factories at the whim of a madman chasing imaginary boogeymen. And to be honest, I kind of wish that was the case, because that at least would be kind of interesting. The production value for these cutscenes is also pretty shit. Like, here's an example of one of these cutscenes.
After the fray, our humanity got the better of us, and we decided to bury them. Wrapped their eyes in seaweed, placed them in graves we dug with our oars. A week later, half my crew died from some cursed sickness. Those wretched Dutch clawed us down into graves we had dug. That island reminds me that mercy has no place in war.
As you can hear, it's some pretty awkward voice acting, and it feels like it's been cut together even more awkwardly. Facial work and character detail is also really not contemporary. I'm not going to say last gen, but it's definitely not up to modern standard. And I mean, just compare that little dialogue sequence to one from Black Flag 11 years ago. Roll it, Stu.
Oh, hi, kid. You missed quite a time.
Aye. Pity about Nassau and Blackbeard flying the coop.
Well, we'll see about Thatch. Vane's off to see him now, and I'm following soon.
This is what's left of your experiment in democracy.
Aye. We do as we please here, and we take our time doing it.
But for Christ's sake, Edward, don't anything but the stink of riches wrinkle your nose.
What's got into you, man?
Reality, mate. Reality. See that you ain't pulled into the drink by this drowning rat.
I mean, look at that scene. It's excellent. It has more than one character. It has really strong voice acting. It has some actual camera work that makes the scene interesting to watch. It has some emotional stakes that you can immediately feel, even if you have no idea what the rest of the story is about. Is it fair to compare Skull and Bones' cutscenes to that of Black Flag? I think it is on some level, but even outside of that, if Skull and Bones had a significantly leaner narrative than what Black Flag had, I think it's still perfectly reasonable to expect cutscenes where the audio is properly edited together. As for what you're actually doing during this campaign, it's like I said before, MMO-style fetch quests with a little bit of narrative dressing. The purpose of this campaign is to introduce you to all of the different types of activities that you can do in Skull and Bones. So you will cut down trees from your boat. You will plunder various land targets, I'll explain that in more detail later. You will destroy merchant ships and claim their cargo. You will destroy warships for various reasons. It never gets any more interesting than that. Because you can't actually do anything on land except talk to people, there can't be any on-land missions, and you might hope that there might be some more interesting or exciting scenario design to some of the, sea missions. But there never is. It's just generic open world style activities over and over again. Doing these will increase your infamy or your level, while also giving you access to plenty of ship upgrade resources, and that's ultimately what this is all about. This campaign does not exist to introduce you to a memorable cast of characters, or to immerse you in a thrilling pirate tale, or to dazzle you with scripted scenarios and set pieces. It really does exist just to introduce you to the sandbox and level you up, and that is it. But here's the thing, right? 20 hours of sailing around as a pirate, discovering new locations, fighting new ship types, upgrading your own ship a bit, experimenting with new weapon types, and getting acquainted with the various sorts of things that this world has to offer, it's okay. The sandbox in this game is decent enough. It does feel good to sail and engage in ship combat. It does feel good to build a new ship and outfit it and decorate it. It does feel good to get KO'd by higher level enemy vessels, retreat with your tail between your legs, farm up some materials, get some new cannons loaded, and then return to send those same foes to Davy Jones's locker. The campaign characters, story, and unique mission design are all basically non-existent, but the campaign experience is definitely carried by the pleasantness of the sandbox and the very primal endorphin release that comes from any well-designed Skinner box. So I spent 20 hours playing through this, and I had a decent enough time. I'm sure many people will hate this and they will think it's super phoned in and boring, and frankly, they are right. But there are definitely going to be some people who just want to be a pirate, and they don't want to be constantly harassed by other players, and they just want to sail around for 10 to 20 hours, do their thing, put the game down after that, and never think about it ever again. Skull and Bones will let you do that. And because most of it is tuned to be very accessible, very playable, and very easy, you just mindlessly roll through it as you do many other Ubisoft open world style games. Speaking of the open worlds, let's talk about that next. Skull and Bones is set in this weird little microcosm place that has both the East Indies and Africa right next to each other. Best not to think too much about the geography. Sadly though, even though you get these two different sort of locations, they don't feel particularly distinct. Their shorelines all look kind of the same. The outposts and forts that dot them all look kind of the same. The ships that patrol them are all exactly the same, but for the colors of their sails and the factions they claim to represent. In terms of overall visuals, Skull and Bones is okay-ish. It has its moments when the sun is hanging low and it bathes an area in a warm orange glow that feels like you're sailing through a tropical Instagram post. Broadly speaking though, Skull and Bones isn't pushing new frontiers when it comes to visual fidelity. It's just very flat, very basic, and the closer you get to it, the worse it looks. I mean, look at this. This is how this game handles waves on a shoreline. Show 'em, Stu. Listen closely, by the way. Do you hear that? There's no sound effects for the waves. 11 years in development, and they couldn't add sound effects to the waves. This brings us to a general block on how buggy this game is. It's definitely quite buggy. I get a crippling audio glitch that actually crashes my audio interface every time I boot up this game, so I then have to restart the interface, and as I'm playing it, sound keeps cutting in and out all of the time, especially when I have menus open. This does not happen in any other game I own, by the way. It is just this one. There are also other weird audio glitches, like a certain high-pitched sound that plays when you're in certain like outposts in the main towns, and oh, it's so annoying. There's currently a bug where you constantly get spammed that your death mark has expired, even though you never even had a death mark. It just keeps spamming over and over again. I got disconnected a handful of times, which really sucks as it ends your mission progress and you need to start again. It's also not been thoroughly playtested in the sense that there are various UI things which don't work and which should have been tidied up at some point during the 11 years of development. So for example, you abandon quests by holding down the X button in your quest log, only there are certain types of quests that require you to first read a treasure map, and you do that by pressing the X button. And they haven't tidied that up, and as a result, there's actually no way to abandon this specific quest in my log. It's stuck in there until I actually do it. Another example is I'd like to be able to fast travel to this location on the map, and I can do so because it's a fast travel port, but because it's got a side quest icon over it, I can't select the port, which means I can't fast travel to it. Furthermore, when I get there to try to get rid of this icon and do whatever it wants me to do, I can't. There's just nothing there for me to interact with, and as a result, this port is now completely closed off to me as a fast travel location. So yeah, despite the lengthy development timeline, it is still buggy and unfinished, and it will still need quite a few months worth of development time to polish up all of this stuff. Outside of visuals and bugs, the world of Skull and Bones actually does have a fair amount to offer, so long as you're up for what it's offering. That shouldn't be too much of a surprise because this is ultimately Ubisoft's biggest strength as a game-making entity. They see video games as structure and system-led, and after that they decorate that scaffolding with a setting, with narrative elements, etc. The central load-bearing pillar in almost any Ubisoft game is not its gameplay or its narrative, it's its structure, and they've had a lot of practice making games that way, and that practice shows here in Skull and Bones. So yeah, you're always heading out on your pirate ship to do something, but what are you doing? Well, we've already covered off harvesting materials, that's one thing, and you'll do a fair amount of that. You can also go fishing. There are dedicated fishing boats that you need to hop into at the start of a fishing mission, and then you scoot about trying to spear sharks or whatever. That food can be used to provide stamina to your ship crew. That is another point we will come back to later, believe me. Another major way to gain resources is just to steal them from other ships by attacking them. You sail around, and so long as you don't make trouble for anybody else, they generally won't make trouble for you. But you can open fire and sink them, at which point you get a kind of pirate wanted rating, as well as a hostility rating versus the faction you just attacked. Reinforcements will continue to arrive and your wanted rating will go up with each new vessel sunk. It's the GTA 5-star wanted rating thing, but for pirates, and it works. It definitely makes it dangerous to attack certain ships in certain locations, and you do need to be aware of how close those ships might be to things like guard turrets or other ships who might turn around and join the fray. There are trade routes that you can discover in this game, which is a really novel idea. I mean, let's say you need a certain type of wood. If you've discovered the right trade route, you can sail over to that route and then begin patrolling it, and chances are the ships that are sailing that route will have the resource you're chasing. It's really immersive because it flows very naturally from the setting. If you want to get a lot of resources really fast, then the best way to do that is plundering. So for this, let's say you need steel, and so you can mine ore and then refine it back in town. Alternatively, you can find a foundry that is smelting steel. You drive your boat up and then you press the plunder button, at which point a little cutscene plays and your buddies jump out of the ship. You stay in, of course. They're the ones having fun on land. You're stuck in the boat, and at that point a progress bar appears at the top of the screen. You need to stay in that zone for X amount of time, and waves of enemy ships will roll in. You defeat them and claim rewards after each wave, complete all waves for maximum rewards, at which point your crew will jump back on board with like a single crate of booze or something, and you'll sail on to your next adventure. What else? Well, there are merchant ship quest givers who require an escort. There are actually treasure hunts, which really just involve getting off your ship at an outpost and running around until a part of the sand glows, and then this really high quality digging animation plays. There are a number of public events that randomly spawn. These are almost always just attacking a convoy of ships, but they can get pretty wild and they're definitely tuned for group play. And of course, there are all manner of side quest contracts which have you doing all of the above at different places across the map. Oh, and there's also a giant sea monster you can hunt, but I never did that, I only saw it in the trailer. The main endgame activity centers on what's called the Helm, which is basically a smuggler's network for rum and opium. You need to gather the sugarcane and poppy that will let you craft this stuff, and then you craft it in your distillery or opium den. You then need to deliver it to targets across the map, and you can't fast travel when you do this, and it's guaranteed to spawn a bunch of very fierce enemy ships who want to take your cargo. It's a little unbalanced at this point, but I'm sure it'll get tweaked. The system opens up even further when you hit max level or kingpin. At that point, it blossoms into this really interesting territory control thing where you need to capture manufactories through either co-op PvE events or actual PvP events. If you're successful, then the factory is now yours, and it will begin producing resources for you that you can then convert into an endgame currency, allowing you to slowly grind out the highest level ships, armaments, and cosmetics. I have not spent a huge amount of time with this, but it seems pretty robust, and if you're someone that wants to spend a little bit of time or a lot of time playing this game, this system is going to always be there for you, giving you something to work towards no matter your time investment. So it's a lot, right? And to be honest, this list is not exhaustive. There are other things that I haven't mentioned here, only because to list everything would take too long. But in a broad sense, there's kind of three categories of activities. There's really relaxed, low-stakes material gathering and deliveries. There's medium-stakes contracts involving sinking enemy ships and plundering land targets. And there's high-stakes activities involving world events, high-level targets, and PvP. So that's certainly not nothing, and while it's not enough to make Skull and Bones a compelling value proposition in its own right, it's more stuff than what we typically might expect from a newly launched live service game. I've reviewed the vast majority of live service games released over the past 5 or 6 years, which is the period in which every publisher started fighting them out as fast as they could, and I've seen plenty of live services that were more shabbily put together and had less content than this one. If the core gameplay of Skull and Bones clicks with you, then there's no shortage of game to be enjoyed here. And while that 11 years of development time didn't serve the game well in many aspects, it definitely allowed the development team to deliver a fairly broad content offering, both during the campaign and at the endgame. And with additional content on the way in the form of seasonal updates, this is the least amount of content that Skull and Bones will ever have, unless they go down the Bungie path and start content vaulting it. But notice what I said about if the core gameplay of Skull and Bones clicks with you. I know it will click for some, absolutely, but for me personally, I found it extremely underwhelming because the underlying sailing and combat mechanics here are just very one-dimensional, and almost unbelievably, they're a step back versus what we got over a decade ago with Black Flag. Let me explain why. Skull and Bones begins with a spectacular naval battle, this one. It's got heaps of ships, they're all skittering about at great speed, and there's massive explosions going off, and the whole thing is just huge. It's meant to be very impressive and showcase what this game is like further down the line, to pique your interest and get you excited about the prospect of owning your own ship capable of this sort of seafaring carnage. For me though, the minute I got control of my ship and started steering it and firing cannons, I was like, oh no, it didn't feel right, it didn't control right, it didn't look right. But I have to be super clear that that feeling came from my intimate experience with Black Flag, and coming back to what I said at the start of this review, let's pretend that Black Flag never existed. Take away any of the comparisons and ask, are the sailing and combat mechanics good? I'll come back to what I've said throughout this review about almost every other aspect of Skull and Bones and say that they're okay. Ship handling is very arcadey. Your ship will accelerate, slow down, and turn on a dime. Your ship seems to glide over the water rather than actually sit in it, which does make for a very responsive and intuitive control scheme, but ultimately one that I think lacks a satisfying sense of feedback and immersion. That's further exacerbated by the fact that 90% of the time, you're sailing and battling on very still, flat water. It's only out in the open seas where you start to get some real chop, and there's almost no reason to go out to the open seas, so where the sea should be this ever-changing modifier that makes navigation and combat more challenging wherever you are, it's instead been removed from the equation almost entirely, making naval engagements feel even more repetitive and predictable than they otherwise might. I'm still going to avoid speaking comparatively, so I will say that on the whole, combat is pretty good. You fire cannons using a reticle system. It does reward precise aim owing to the weak points that ships now have, and there's definitely some skill involved with judging the speed of your vessel versus their vessel versus the distance to each other and the travel time of your projectiles. There's also a very large range of weapons that you can mount on a variety of positions on your ship. You may want long guns or torpedoes at the front, allowing for precise strikes as you close in on a target. You might want a simple set of cannons for your port side, since that weapon is very versatile, but on your starboard you might want a broadside broadside cannon that aims to rip holes in the enemy's hull, inflicting the flood damage effect, which deals damage over time. Of course, there's the fire barrels you can drop off the back, as well as mortars and rockets and ballistas and a few other things. The way that aiming works is that it's a very easily repositioned reticle, which is less dependent upon ship positioning. It lets you hit targets more easily, more often, which definitely adds to the more arcadey feel of combat and the overall accessibility of the game. Things like ramming and the ability to fire muskets or throw firebombs from your deck are also there, and that's about it. But that's a fair amount, and in defense of all of this, one of the reasons that I enjoyed my time with Skull and Bones is that it ultimately feels pretty good, and it really fits the game's focus on accessibility and pleasantness. You don't need to fight the controls to make things happen here. You can pick this up and immediately understand how to play it and do it well. Skull and Bones was never meant to be a simulation or anything close to it. It was meant to be something simple and accessible and fun, and the sailing and combat model definitely achieves those goals. And had Black Flag never existed, or had I never played it, I might have thought this was pretty great. But Black Flag does exist, and I have played it, and now that I have judged the sailing and combat on their individual merits, I will now speak comparatively and say that these things feel so much worse than what we got in Black Flag. The simple feel of what it's like to steer a ship here is such a step back. In Black Flag, your vessel sat so heavy in the water, it was so much slower to turn without being cumbersome, the ocean swell made its presence felt so much more often, and you regularly had to fight in stormy weather that completely transformed the look and feel of combat. Perspective is also a really big deal. You do actually have a sort of first-person perspective in Skull and Bones, but there's almost no reason to use it when that pulled-back perspective exists. Yeah, that pulled-back perspective gives you a better view of things, but it's just so much less immersive, and I really wonder how much better Skull and Bones would have been had it focused more on that first-person view. Combat also just looks better in Black Flag because it's not so explosion-y. Like, if you watch a naval battle in Black Flag, you'll see that the main thing that happens when a volley of cannonballs hits a hull isn't explosions, but splintering. Because that's what happens when you send a big iron ball into a wooden wall. It splinters. And so as soon as I saw how leveraged Skull and Bones was into these big explosions, I was like, nah man, that just doesn't look right. To me, a big issue is how much less important positioning is in Skull and Bones. In Black Flag, if you wanted to do a broadside attack, you needed to present your broadside. The cannons didn't turn left or right very much, only up and down, so you really needed to maneuver your ship to get the angle you needed, and then arc your shot based on the distance. Here in Skull and Bones, it's not like that. Cannons are on magic swivels and can turn in almost any direction aimed by a reticle. As such, you don't need to be well positioned to take a shot. You just need to aim your reticle, and it can reach some very extreme angles that seem very goofy. It also leads to some really cheesy and gamey techniques, since you've got 4 weapons at different sides of your ship, and as you turn your ship, you can see a dotted line that denotes which cannon is usable based on the angle, and there's no dead zone anywhere near that dotted line. So you can actually do this sort of 180 spin that lets you unload your left cannon and then immediately turn just a few degrees to unload your rear cannon, and then continue to turn, and then you can very quickly unload your right cannon. And yeah, sure, it's like a technical maneuver, but it's really simple to execute, and it's just dumb. It was just so much better when cannons were in fixed positions and you had to properly steer your ship. It felt so rewarding when you landed a clean broadside in Black Flag. In Skull and Bones, I just feel like, oh yay, I moved the cursor over the thing. Good going me. Then of course, there's the ship boarding, which we've already talked about, and no matter which way you slice that, it is just a massive, massive downgrade. I know all the reasons why it is the way that it is, but none of that changes the fact that this is a massive downgrade. Stamina is the other thing that really, really blows in Skull and Bones. So for some unknown reason, I'm guessing PvP balance maybe, your ship or its crew have a stamina bar. If you're going at top speed, your stamina will slowly deplete, forcing you to then considerably slow your speed while you wait for this stamina bar to recharge. This is active all the time, both in and out of combat. Now listen, stamina bars in open world games where you have to run around a lot really suck. But a stamina bar for a fucking pirate ship? Are you kidding me right now? And if you want to have that active during combat, okay, sure, maybe, whatever. But to have it active all the time when I'm trying to sail across an ocean and I have the wind at my back and my sail's full, but I have to slow down because apparently my crew wants a snack. There is a food consumable system that kicks in here that recovers their stamina. So yeah, that is just, it's just ridiculous. So do you see what I mean when I say that this is worse than Black Flag? Like, yeah, there's a colored loot cannon system, and some of those cannons specialize in ripping holes in sails, and others do burn damage, and others can heal allied ships for some unknown reason. And those things certainly deepen combat to an extent, especially if you want to get into the PvP side of things. For me though, the overall combat framework just doesn't hit right, partly because I've experienced something better, but mainly because it's just not that deep or interesting. A lot of the things that gave Black Flag's combat depth and the wow factor, they aren't carried over here. I find it less fun to watch and less fun to play. Maybe if I hadn't played Black Flag, I could get over that. But like I said, I have, so I can't. I'm sure there's more than a few people watching this review being like, come on man, it's unfair to compare this to Black Flag so much, it's its own game, and it should be reviewed on those terms. And you know what? I agree. And that is what I've tried to do during this review. In my intro, I made that specific call out, and I said that if you remove the context and comparisons, Skull and Bones is broadly fine. When I spoke about the campaign, I said that there was not much to it, but world activities combined with the Skinner box progression make it relatively enjoyable. When it comes to world design and endgame, I called out that there's a surprising amount of content here, far more than what many other live service games offer at their launch. And when it comes to core mechanics like sailing and combat, I said that they're very functional and accessible, it's very pick up and play, and you can certainly have some fun with them, absolutely. And that is why I have not titled this review, I do not recommend, because on its merits, Skull and Bones is fine. It's a lot more fine than I suspect most people expect. But as I said at the top, I do think the context matters. This $70 price point for this game is silly. It is nowhere near polished enough, nor impressive enough to warrant that price tag, especially given that the game has plenty of in-game spending options and a season pass. Had this game come out at $30 to $40 US, Ubisoft would have saved themselves a lot of headaches, and I think people would have been much more receptive to this. The commentary from Yves Guillemot that this is a quadruple A game, that really lit a fire under everybody, because it's rare to see such a brazen effort to gaslight us. No one with a functioning brain could ever think for a second that this is a quadruple A game, and to be told that by Ubisoft's CEO is like infuriating, because it shows how little respect he has for us as consumers and ultimately his shareholders, which is who he was addressing these comments to. But the most fascinating thing about Skull and Bones is its lineage. I've long held the belief that the biggest problem with live services is that they are launched as live services, rather than launching a really good game that people like, and then you can bolt on more to it over time to evolve it into a live service. Deep Rock Galactic sort of falls into that category, and it's going exceptionally strong even today. No Man's Sky is kind of like that too, even though they don't charge for their updates. It's like, make a good game, and if people like it, make some more of it. You know what I mean? And this ultimately was what Ubisoft had the chance to do with Black Flag and Skull and Bones. You take the best Assassin's Creed game, sorry not sorry, and you take all of that work, and then you build on top of it to make something bigger and better. That is a slam dunk proposition, and it's no surprise that Ubisoft greenlit this project. But Ubisoft Singapore and the 32 other Ubisoft studios listed in this game's credits didn't do that. They took one of the greatest games ever made, removed massive chunks of it, and the parts that they did keep, they made them worse. And then Ubisoft's management added in an in-game store, a $70 price tag, and they slapped a quadruple A label on it. Like, isn't that just insane? That is insane. It very much reminds me of Rainbow Six Siege Extraction. Remember that game? No, you don't. No one does. I said in my review of that Extraction had the benefit of being able to leverage the characters, weapons, settings, and mechanics of one of the best shooters on the market, and all Extraction had to do was innovate on top of that to deliver something new and better. And it couldn't do that. I said of it then what I'll say of Skull and Bones now. These games were born on the other side of the finish line, but they still found a way to come last place. Skull and Bones is fine. If you can get it for $30 after they've polished it up, you might have a good time with it, but as a statement on how far backwards the business of video games has moved over the last decade, Skull and Bones is a bold one. I certainly leave plenty of room for the fact that this could improve substantially over time, and I expect that it will, but we didn't need to wait for 3 years of post-launch updates for Assassin's Creed Black Flag to be incredible. It was incredible from the moment you took it out of the cling wrap, and I want to go back to those days. Gentlemen, how are we doing with those New Year's resolutions? Still hitting the gym? Still eating clean? Read any new books? How's your woodworking project coming along? If it still looks like a stump, you are not alone. Sticking to New Year's resolutions is hard, but there's one resolution you can keep very easily thanks to this video's sponsor, Manscaped. And that's the resolution to tidy up your downstairs, and I'm not talking about your basement. If you're up to start heading down, then you couldn't have picked a better moment because Manscaped just released their Performance Package 5.0 Ultra, and let me tell you, it's got futuristic tendencies. In the kit is the all-new Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra, the most advanced ball trimmer in the history of the human species. Your body hair will tremble in fear at the sight of it, for it knows it cannot withstand the two interchangeable blades, one of them skimming off the top, and the new foil blade for a closer shave. The hair can try to run and hide, but it will not succeed, for the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra features dual LED spotlights to provide contrast on multiple skin tones. With that sort of illumination, there is nowhere for those wayward hairs to hide. That's not all though, since the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra also features 3 length-setting combs, plus it's waterproof, making it safe to use in the shower and very easy to clean. The Performance Package 5.0 also includes the nose and ear hair trimming Weed Whacker 2.0, as well as the Crop Soother Aftershave Lotion and the Crop Preserver Anti-Chafe Ball Deodorant. Once they touch your sack, you'll never go back. Hell, Manscaped are feeling generous, and so right now if you grab the Performance Pack 5.0, you also get some Manscaped boxes, very comfy, as well as the Shed 2.0 travel bag. Resolutions may come and go, but a well-groomed you is here to stay with Manscaped's latest and greatest. So start the new year right, because when you look good, you feel good, and Manscaped will help you sculpt the best version of yourself for the year ahead. Get 20% off plus free shipping with offer code SKILLUP at manscaped.com. That's 20% off with free shipping with the code SKILLUP at manscaped.com. New year, new you, and definitely a new trimmer. Manscaped's got your grooming resolutions covered. Thanks Manscaped for sponsoring the video, and thank you for watching it.